The war was not misunderstood. That is the first thing that needs to be said, plainly and without qualification. The idea that Vietnam was a tragedy born of confusion, a well-intentioned enterprise that somehow lost its way in the jungle, is itself a product of the same machinery that prosecuted the war. The architects of that conflict understood what they were doing with a precision that would be uncomfortable to acknowledge even now, decades after the last American helicopter lifted off a Saigon rooftop. They understood the terrain, understood the enemy, understood the limits of their own strategy, and they proceeded anyway. What gets called misunderstanding was in most cases a deliberate choice to substitute one reality for another, to take the messy, intractable facts of Southeast Asia and replace them with numbers, with briefing charts, with press releases, with a language of progress that could be delivered to a president and a public who needed to believe that something was being accomplished. The war was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented, systematically and institutionally, from the earliest days of American involvement through to the final collapse. And that distinction matters because misunderstanding implies an honest mistake, and what happened in Vietnam was not honest. American military advisors were present in Vietnam years before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, years before the troop deployments that most Americans think of as the beginning of the war. By the early 1960s, there were thousands of American personnel operating in South Vietnam in capacities that were officially described as advisory, but that in practice included combat operations, reconnaissance missions, and the kind of direct engagement that tends to produce casualties. Those casualties were real. The men who died in those early years were real. But the deaths were managed carefully, classified when possible, described in language that obscured their nature when they could not be hidden entirely. The official position for years was that American forces were advising, training, supporting. The lived reality was different from the first day. When the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred in August of 1964, the Johnson administration used it to secure congressional authorization for a dramatic escalation of the war. What the administration told Congress and the American public was that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked American destroyers in international waters on 2 separate occasions, the second attack unprovoked and unambiguous. What the classified record showed was considerably more complicated. The first incident on August 2nd did involve a genuine engagement between North Vietnamese boats and the destroyer Maddox, though the Maddox had been operating in support of South Vietnamese commando raids against North Vietnamese coastal installations, a fact that was not disclosed. The second incident on August 4th almost certainly never happened. The sailors aboard the Turner Joy and the Maddox reported sonar contacts and radar returns in deteriorating weather conditions, and some officers on scene believed they were firing at real targets. But within hours, the commander of the task force was sending cables expressing serious doubts about whether any attack had taken place. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara received those doubts. President Johnson received them. The resolution went through Congress anyway. Johnson himself reportedly said privately that those sailors were shooting at whales. He sent the request for authorization to Congress regardless. This is not a footnote to the Vietnam War. It is the war. The decision to proceed on the basis of an incident that senior officials had strong reason to doubt was re-established the template for everything that followed. If the premise of the escalation could be manufactured, or at minimum knowingly left unverified, then the metrics of the escalation could be manufactured too, and they were. The body count became the central measurement of success in Vietnam in a way that has no real parallel in American military history. General William Westmoreland, who commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, embraced attrition as the core strategy. The idea was straightforward in theory: kill enough of the enemy, degrade his forces beyond his ability to replace them, and eventually he would have to stop fighting. Progress in this strategy would be measured by comparing enemy casualties to American and South Vietnamese casualties, and by tracking the rate at which the enemy was losing fighters against the rate at which he could recruit or infiltrate replacements. The body count was supposed to be the empirical foundation of a scientific approach to war. What it became was something else entirely. The pressure to produce favorable body counts flowed downward through the chain of command with a consistency and force that transformed the metric from a measurement tool into an end in itself. Officers whose units produced high body counts received favorable efficiency reports. Officers whose counts were low faced questions about their aggressiveness. The incentive structure was clear, and it operated at every level from platoon through division. The result was predictable. Body counts were inflated. Sometimes the inflation was relatively minor, a matter of rounding up or counting enemy fighters whose deaths were probable but not confirmed. But the inflation extended well beyond rounding errors. Civilians killed in operations were regularly counted as enemy combatants. The justification was simple and chilling in its circularity. Anyone killed in a free fire zone was by definition a valid target, and therefore a valid body count entry. The designation of an area as a free fire zone was an administrative decision made at higher command levels, and it converted entire populations in certain areas into presumptive enemies. When those populations suffered casualties, the casualties appeared in the count as enemy dead. There were soldiers who kept private tallies that did not match what they reported up the chain. There were officers who knew that the numbers they were transmitting to higher headquarters were false. Some of them said so internally, in memoranda that went into files and stayed there. The institutional response to dissent within the counting system was not to reform the system, but to isolate the dissenters. Men who raised questions about body count accuracy found that their concerns did not receive serious responses. They found themselves marginalized. Some found that their own careers stalled, while contemporaries who produced better numbers were promoted. By the time Robert McNamara's staff was analyzing body count data in Washington to produce assessments of the war's progress, the numbers they were working with had passed through multiple layers of inflation and selection. McNamara himself was a former president of Ford Motor Company, a man who had spent his career in organizations that measured everything, who believed in the power of quantification to reveal truth. He applied this belief to Vietnam with genuine conviction. He assembled teams of analysts who produced charts showing the crossover point at which American attrition of the enemy would exceed the enemy's ability to replace his losses. Those charts were based on data that was fundamentally corrupted at the source. McNamara did not know this, or did not fully know it, or perhaps knew it in some partial way, and chose not to examine the question too closely. The honest answer is probably that it was some combination of all three, and the proportions varied over time as evidence accumulated that the numbers did not reflect reality. What is clear is that the analytical framework he imposed on the war was a machine that processed false inputs and produced false outputs, and those outputs shaped decisions that sent hundreds of thousands of men into combat. The Strategic Hamlet program was an earlier attempt to measure progress through a different kind of metric. The idea was to relocate South Vietnamese rural populations into fortified villages, where they could be protected from Viet Cong influence and recruitment. The number of hamlets pacified, the number of people living in secure areas, would serve as measures of progress in the other war, the political and social competition for the loyalties of the South Vietnamese population. The program produced impressive statistics. By the official count, hundreds of hamlets were pacified, and millions of South Vietnamese were living in secure strategic hamlets. The reality was that many of the hamlets designated as pacified were pacified only on paper. Local officials reported what they needed to report. Some hamlets that appeared in the statistics had never been built. Others had been built, but then abandoned, as soon as American attention moved elsewhere. The Viet Cong operated freely in areas officially listed as pacified. The program created a parallel reality of numbers that bore an uncertain and often inverse relationship to conditions on the ground. When the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive in January 1968, attacking dozens of towns and cities across South Vietnam, including the American Embassy compound in Saigon, the gap between the official statistical reality and the actual reality became impossible to sustain publicly. But the pattern it represented had been operating for years before anyone outside the system was able to see it clearly. The men who fought in Vietnam lived inside a set of contradictions that the official record was not designed to accommodate. A soldier in the field understood things about the war that no briefing chart could capture. He understood that the same village could be cleared of enemy presence 3 times in a month and still harbor enemy fighters on the 4th visit. He understood that the people in that village might cooperate with American forces during the day and with the Viet Cong at night. Not out of ideological commitment, but out of the rational calculation that both sides had the power to harm them, and neither side had demonstrated the ability to protect them reliably. He understood that the enemy he was fighting knew the terrain in a way that no amount of American firepower could compensate for. That the enemy could absorb casualties that would be catastrophic for any conventional military force, and continue operating because the war he was fighting was not a conventional military contest. The soldier understood these things through direct experience and could not explain them in the language of the official war, which was a language of areas secured and enemies killed and progress made. The 1-year tour policy contributed to this disconnection in ways that were recognized at the time and continue to be discussed by veterans decades later. American soldiers in Vietnam served 12-month tours, after which they rotated home and were replaced by soldiers who were new to the country, new to the conditions, and had to relearn through experience what their predecessors had learned. The policy was implemented in part to manage the domestic political costs of the war, to spread the burden of service across a wider population, and prevent the war from consuming the same units and the same individuals for years at a stretch. It also served the purposes of career development for officers who needed combat command time to advance and who therefore rotated through command positions on schedules that served personnel management objectives rather than operational continuity. The result was that institutional knowledge was systematically destroyed. Units that had learned to operate effectively in a particular area, had built relationships with local populations, had developed understanding of local enemy patterns, were broken up and reconstituted with men who knew nothing. The lessons had to be learned again at cost. Drug use among American troops in Vietnam reached levels that the military establishment found difficult to acknowledge during the war and has found difficult to process fully in the decades since. The availability of high-quality heroin and marijuana in Vietnam was not accidental. Both were readily obtainable throughout the country, and their use spread through American units in ways that senior commanders observed and documented in internal reports, while publicly maintaining that the problem, though present, was being managed. By the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, studies conducted by military medical personnel found heroin addiction rates among American troops that were startling. Some estimates suggested that a significant fraction of soldiers in Vietnam had tried heroin, and a substantial portion of those had developed dependencies. The military's response to this reality went through several phases: initial denial, subsequent acknowledgement accompanied by claims of effective intervention programs, and a persistent reluctance to confront the ways in which the conditions of the war itself, the boredom and the terror and the moral confusion, created demand for substances that altered consciousness. Men who were sent to fight in a war whose purpose was unclear, in conditions that were dangerous and unpredictable, on behalf of a South Vietnamese government whose legitimacy and popular support were genuinely questionable, found their own ways of managing the gap between what they had been told the war was and what it actually was. The military and the government treated the drug problem as a discipline failure rather than a symptom, and treated the symptom with punitive measures that did not address the conditions that produced it. The fragging phenomenon, which refers to the killing or attempted killing of unpopular or dangerous officers by their own men, reached its peak in the period from 1969 to 1972 and represented something that had no real precedent in American military experience. The term came from the fragmentation grenades that were sometimes used in these incidents, rolled into an officer's hooch at night, or placed where they would detonate at a time and place that allowed the perpetrators to claim ignorance of the mechanism. Official statistics recorded several hundred confirmed or suspected fragging incidents during the Vietnam War. But the actual number was almost certainly higher because many incidents were investigated perfunctorily or not at all, and because the line between accidental death in combat and deliberate killing was not always possible to draw cleanly in the conditions of Vietnam. Officers who pushed their men into operations that seemed suicidal or pointless, who cared more about their own advancement than the safety of their soldiers, who were perceived as reckless or incompetent or simply cruel, became targets. The institution acknowledged this phenomenon with difficulty because it represented a fundamental breakdown in military authority, a situation in which the normal mechanisms of discipline and hierarchy had ceased to function in their intended direction. The men at the bottom of the hierarchy were exercising a form of lethal veto over the decisions of the men above them, and they were doing so in numbers large enough that the institution had to find ways to adapt rather than simply punishing its way back to compliance. The relationship between American forces and the South Vietnamese Army, known as ARVN, was a source of tension and frustration that ran through the entire American involvement in the war, but was rarely addressed directly in public statements. American commanders and advisors frequently found that ARVN units were unwilling to take the aggressive offensive action that American strategy required, that ARVN commanders sometimes had prior arrangements with local Viet Cong that allowed both sides to coexist in a condition of tacit non-belligerence, that corruption within ARVN extended from the enlisted ranks through the officer corps to the generals, that soldiers were sometimes not paid and sometimes fed inadequately and sometimes led by officers who had purchased their commissions and had no military competence. American advisors who documented these problems in their reports found that the reports were received, filed, and not acted upon because acting on them would require confronting the fundamental question of whether the South Vietnamese government and military were capable of sustaining themselves without indefinite American support. And that was a question whose honest answer was incompatible with the official justification for the war. The pacification program that the Americans called CORDS, which stood for Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, represented a later and more sophisticated attempt to fight the political and social dimensions of the conflict. It was managed by Robert Comer, a CIA officer known within the government for his aggressive advocacy and his impatience with bureaucratic obstruction, whose nickname was Blowtorch. Comer brought genuine organizational energy to the pacification effort and produced a measurement system of considerable complexity, the Hamlet Evaluation System, which rated every hamlet in South Vietnam on a scale that combined security, development, and political factors into a composite score. The system was elaborate, and the data it generated was voluminous. It was also subject to the same incentive pressures that corrupted every other measurement system the Americans deployed in Vietnam. Provincial advisors, who reported stagnation or deterioration in their areas, faced questions about their effectiveness. The system produced data showing steady improvement across most of South Vietnam during the period it operated, and that data was used to support claims of progress in pacification that did not match what reporters and independent observers were finding when they traveled through the countryside. Phoenix program operated within the pacification effort as an intelligence and interdiction program aimed at identifying and neutralizing the Viet Cong infrastructure, which was the term used for the political, administrative, and logistical networks that sustained the insurgency. Neutralization was the official term used to describe the program's outcomes, and it covered a range of actions including capture, defection, and killing. The program produced statistics showing large numbers of Viet Cong infrastructure members neutralized each year. Those statistics were subject to the same pressures as every other set of numbers in the war. Local officials and South Vietnamese police, who were responsible for much of the program's implementation, had incentives to meet quotas that were set at higher levels. And meeting quotas was easier if the definition of Viet Cong infrastructure was applied broadly. There were people killed under the program who were genuine enemy operatives. There were also people killed who were local enemies of the officials responsible for identifying targets, personal adversaries, business competitors, people who had disputed a land claim or refused to pay a bribe. The program operated in conditions where accountability was minimal and where the institutional pressure was always toward higher numbers rather than more accurate numbers. Veterans who participated in the program have described operations that resulted in the deaths of people whose connection to the Viet Cong was unclear or non-existent. Those accounts went into classified files. The official history of the program emphasized its contribution to the ultimate withdrawal of American forces. The air war over North Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia added dimensions of destructive capacity and moral complexity that the ground war alone could not supply. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that ran from 1965 to 1968, dropped more tonnage of bombs than all the Allied bombing of Europe in World War II. The targets, in theory, were military and industrial in nature: supply routes, storage facilities, power plants, transportation infrastructure. In practice, the distinction between military and civilian targets in a country at war was never as clear as the targeting criteria suggested, and the scale of the bombing created civilian casualties and destruction of civilian infrastructure that was acknowledged internally and minimized publicly. The bombing also failed to achieve its stated objectives. North Vietnam's industrial base was limited enough that destroying it did not prevent the resupply of forces in the south. The supply lines ran through terrain that was difficult to hit effectively from the air, and the North Vietnamese and their allies proved extraordinarily adaptive in repairing damage and finding alternative routes. The bombing was continued because stopping it would require acknowledging that it had not worked, and acknowledging that it had not worked would require reconsidering the strategy, and reconsidering the strategy would require confronting questions about the war's fundamental premises that the administration was not prepared to confront. The bombing of Cambodia presents a particularly stark example of the gap between official statements and actual operations. From 1969 to 1973, American B-52s conducted a sustained bombing campaign against targets in Cambodia under the name Operation Menu, with individual operations named after courses in a meal: breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, dessert, supper. The campaign was conducted in secret from the American public and from Congress, with falsified flight records submitted to prevent the true target locations from appearing in official documentation. Crews were given one set of coordinates for the official record and different coordinates for the actual bombing run. The tonnage dropped on Cambodia during this period exceeded the total tonnage dropped on Japan during World War II. The human cost in Cambodian civilian casualties was significant and has never been fully documented. The political cost to the Cambodian state was catastrophic. The Khmer Rouge, which had been a marginal and largely ineffectual guerrilla movement before the bombing campaign, grew substantially in the devastated rural areas where the bombing had destroyed communities and created populations with nothing to lose. The connection between the American bombing and the subsequent Khmer Rouge genocide is contested among historians, but the connection between the bombing and the destabilization of Cambodia is not seriously disputed. None of this was available to the American public while it was happening. The falsified records were accurate records in the official filing system. The Cambodia operation did not exist. Soldiers who served in Vietnam during the later years of the war, particularly from 1969 onward, as the Nixon administration's Vietnamization policy began withdrawing American units while reducing offensive operations, experienced a particular variety of corrosion. The policy itself acknowledged implicitly that the war could not be won in the conventional sense, that the American objective had shifted from victory to extraction, from defeating the enemy to creating conditions under which South Vietnam might sustain itself without American ground forces. This was not how it was described publicly. Publicly, the administration maintained that the war was being pursued vigorously and that South Vietnam was being strengthened for the challenge ahead. In the field, soldiers understood that they were being asked to continue risking their lives for objectives that their own government had effectively conceded were unachievable. The institutional response to this understanding was an intensification of the bureaucratic incentives to perform. Units were still evaluated on body counts and other metrics. Officers still needed combat command time for their personnel files. The machinery of the war continued to operate, even as the strategic rationale for operating it had been quietly abandoned. The My Lai massacre in March of 1968, in which American soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, killed between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians in a village in Quang Ngai province, was known to some people within the military command structure almost immediately after it occurred. A helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson, who observed the massacre from the air and intervened to protect some of the civilians, filed a formal complaint through military channels. His complaint was investigated, and the investigation produced a report that was classified and filed. The incident was described officially as a combat engagement that resulted in enemy casualties. It remained officially invisible for more than a year, until investigative journalist Seymour Hersh obtained the story through sources outside the official channels and published it in November of 1969. The massacre was not an isolated aberration in an otherwise clean war. It was an extreme instance of practices that existed along a spectrum in many operations in the Vietnam War. Practices of treating civilian populations in contested areas as presumptive enemies, of using firepower against villages and hamlets in ways that produced civilian casualties regardless of military necessity, of accepting civilian deaths as an operational byproduct without significant accountability for the individuals who ordered or carried out the operations. The massacre at My Lai was exceptional in its scale and its directness. The conditions that produced it were not exceptional. The men who participated in it had been through months of operations in which the distinction between combatant and non-combatant had been systematically eroded, in which the deaths of civilians had been routinely reclassified as enemy casualties, in which the psychological distance between killing enemy fighters and killing anyone in the wrong place had been progressively shortened. William Calley, who was convicted of murder and served a small fraction of a relatively lenient sentence, became in the public narrative the responsible individual, the one bad actor whose punishment discharged the institutional accountability for what had happened. The investigation conducted by General William Peers, which documented the broader pattern of conduct and cover-up, was less visible in the public record, and its findings did not result in significant accountability for the officers higher up the chain who knew what had happened and did nothing. The treatment of prisoners by American forces and by South Vietnamese forces, acting in coordination with Americans or under American direction, existed in a space that official policy designated as prohibited and operational reality, populated with practices that violated those prohibitions routinely. The laws of war and the Geneva Conventions were part of the official framework within which the war was supposed to be conducted. Training included instruction in these requirements. The actual treatment of prisoners in the field, particularly in the early stages after capture when intelligence value was highest, and when the disorientation and fear of the prisoner could be exploited most effectively, frequently included coercive interrogation methods that violated the legal framework. The Phoenix program, which relied heavily on intelligence gathered through interrogation, operated provincial interrogation centers where methods that would now be classified as torture were used systematically. The Americans who worked within that system had varying degrees of awareness of what occurred in those centers and varying degrees of involvement. Some participated directly, some authorized practices while maintaining a formal distance from the implementation. Some reported their concerns through channels that did not result in reform. The official position throughout was that American forces complied with the laws of war and that violations when they occurred were individual failures rather than systematic practice. The documentary record, including internal reports and after-action reviews, tells a different story. The American prisoners held in North Vietnam occupied a unique psychological space in the American narrative of the war. The POWs in Hanoi became symbols of American suffering and endurance in a way that served multiple purposes for the Nixon administration. which elevated the POW issue to a central justification for continued American involvement. The treatment of American prisoners by North Vietnam was brutal and in many cases constituted systematic torture. That is true and documented by the men who survived it. It is also true that the American government used the POW issue instrumentally, deploying it as justification for war policies that had other motivations, using it to generate domestic support for a war that was otherwise losing public backing, constructing a narrative in which American prisoners were the primary reason to stay engaged militarily in Southeast Asia. The POWs themselves had no say in how their captivity was used. Some returned from captivity deeply uncomfortable with the political use that had been made of their suffering. Most said nothing publicly. The narrative was too useful to too many people with too much power. The South Vietnamese civilians who were displaced by the war numbered in the millions. The systematic destruction of villages in contested areas, through airstrikes and artillery and ground operations that treated rural populations as security threats, created refugee flows of extraordinary scale. By some estimates, more than 3 million South Vietnamese were displaced from their homes during the American phase of the war. They were concentrated in camps and urban areas where conditions were often inadequate, where the social structures that had sustained rural life were absent, where they were dependent on a government and an American aid apparatus that was simultaneously fighting a war and attempting to administer a country, and consistently prioritized the military dimensions of the problem over the humanitarian ones. The disruption of South Vietnamese rural society served the official theory in one sense, in that it denied the Viet Cong access to the population base from which it drew recruits and supplies. It destroyed the social fabric that gave South Vietnamese identity its coherence, created populations who had no stake in the South Vietnamese government because the South Vietnamese government had taken their homes and their livelihoods in the name of protecting them, and produced conditions in the cities that generated exactly the kind of social dysfunction and political instability that the American effort was supposed to prevent. The role of Agent Orange and other herbicide agents in the Vietnam War is a story about the gap between official assurances and known risks that continued to widen for decades after the war ended. The herbicide program, known as Operation Ranch Hand, sprayed millions of gallons of defoliants over South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia between 1962 and 1971, with the purpose of destroying jungle cover that concealed enemy movements and eliminating crops in areas controlled by the enemy. The total area affected was in the millions of acres. Agent Orange, the most widely used of the herbicides, contained dioxin as a contaminant, and dioxin is among the most toxic compounds known to science. The health effects on American veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange, including elevated rates of certain cancers, neurological conditions, and birth defects in their children, were documented in studies conducted after the war, and have been the basis for legal and administrative claims that the government resisted for years before partially acknowledging them. The health effects on Vietnamese civilians and veterans who were exposed are orders of magnitude larger in scale and have received far less official attention. The Vietnamese government estimates that millions of its citizens were exposed and that hundreds of thousands have suffered health effects, and that the contamination of soil and water in heavily sprayed areas continues to affect populations in those regions today. American manufacturers of the herbicide and the American government that contracted for its production and use engaged in litigation over liability for decades, while the people affected by the exposure continued to die and to bear children with conditions that the exposure had caused. The Hmong people of Laos were recruited and organized into a secret army by the CIA beginning in the late 1950s. A force that at its peak numbered in the tens of thousands and that bore the burden of the ground war in Laos against North Vietnamese forces and the Pathet Lao. The secret war in Laos was secret from the American public, not from the people fighting it. General Vang Pao led the Hmong resistance with CIA backing and direction, and the Hmong fighters and their families paid a catastrophic price for their alliance with the United States. Casualties among Hmong military age men were staggering. By some estimates, the Hmong lost a higher proportion of their population to the war than any other group involved in the broader conflict. When the American withdrawal from Southeast Asia came, the United States evacuated some Hmong leaders and fighters and left many more behind to face retribution from the victorious communists. The thousands of Hmong who were settled in the United States as refugees in the years following the war were the survivors of a community that had been used as an instrument of American policy and then abandoned when the policy changed. The secret war in Laos was not officially acknowledged by the United States government for years after it ended. The Hmong who fought in it had no diplomatic standing that would allow them to claim the protections or the benefits that might otherwise have attached to service as American allies. They had fought a war that the United States officially denied was happening. The reporting of the Vietnam War by American journalists stationed in Saigon and in the field produced some of the most consequential journalism of the 20th century, and also produced a set of myths about the relationship between press freedom and military failure that have distorted American thinking about both journalism and warfare ever since. The military establishment, beginning during the war and continuing long afterward, developed and promoted the narrative that American military operations were achieving their objectives in Vietnam, until the press coverage turned the American public against the war and deprived the military of the political support it needed to win. This narrative is sometimes called the stab in the back theory by its critics, and what the historical record actually shows is substantially different. The correspondents who reported critically on the war, figures like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan and Peter Arnett, were not inventing a reality that did not exist. They were reporting on a reality that the official briefings, known in Saigon as the 5 o'clock follies for the reliability of their relationship to truth, were systematically obscuring. When military officials claimed that a particular area had been pacified and journalists found that area to be actively contested, the journalists were not distorting the truth. They were reporting it. The press coverage that turned American public opinion against the war was not a cause of American defeat, but a consequence of an information environment that could not sustain official claims against the weight of observable reality indefinitely. The Pentagon Papers, The Secret History of American Involvement in Vietnam, commissioned by McNamara and completed in 1969, documented the gap between official statements and internal assessments in terms so damning that the Nixon administration sought to prevent their publication in the most aggressive manner available, up to and including pursuing criminal charges against the analyst who leaked them, Daniel Ellsberg. What the papers showed was that every administration from Truman through Johnson had made public statements about Vietnam that they knew to be inconsistent with their private assessments. They showed that decision-makers had routinely chosen the course of action that maintained the appearance of progress over courses of action that might have led to earlier, if less face-saving, conclusions. They showed that the war had been prosecuted less because decision-makers believed it was winnable than because they believed the domestic political costs of losing it were too high to bear, and that this calculation had been made explicitly, internally, in documents that were at the same time generating public justifications based on the imperative of containing communism and honoring America's commitments to its allies. The papers were a record of institutional self-deception and public deception so thorough that when they were published, they seemed to some readers not like revelations, but like confirmations of things that the internal contradictions of the official narrative had made it reasonable to suspect. The soldiers who came home from Vietnam experienced a reception from American society that was in many respects the domestic extension of the institutional denial that had characterized the war itself. The traditional ceremonies of return that had accompanied the end of previous wars, the parades, and the public acknowledgement were absent or minimal for Vietnam veterans. Some veterans report being told not to wear their uniforms in public to avoid hostile reactions. Some report direct hostility. The picture of veterans being spat upon by anti-war protesters has become a cultural fixture that the historical record does not fully support, with researchers finding few documented incidents that match the commonly told stories. But the psychological reality of social rejection was real in other forms. The country was deeply divided about the war, and veterans carried the war home with them into a society that had not resolved what the war had meant, and was not eager to work through that question with the people who had most directly experienced it. The Veterans Administration, later the Department of Veterans Affairs, processed the needs of Vietnam veterans through bureaucratic structures that were not designed for the scale or the nature of what those veterans presented. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not recognized as a diagnostic category until 1980, years after hundreds of thousands of veterans were already experiencing its symptoms. The Agent Orange health claims were resisted institutionally. The psychological casualties of the war, men whose functioning had been permanently altered by their experiences, were scattered through communities across the country without the institutional resources to recognize or treat what they were experiencing. The Montagnard peoples of the Central Highlands of Vietnam occupy a place in the war's story that is similar in some respects to the Hmong of Laos, though with important differences. These indigenous peoples, who had lived in the highlands for millennia before the Vietnamese states that claimed their territory, were recruited by American Special Forces as fighters and intelligence assets because their knowledge of the terrain was irreplaceable and because their traditional hostility toward the lowland Vietnamese north and south made them available for recruitment by the side that appeared most likely to protect their autonomy. American Special Forces soldiers who worked with the Montagnard peoples developed personal relationships of genuine depth with their counterparts. Relationships that the institutional machinery of the war repeatedly subordinated to other priorities. When American strategy required accommodation of South Vietnamese government concerns about the Montagnard independence movement, the American protection of Montagnard interests gave way. When the war ended and the South Vietnamese government collapsed, the Montagnard fighters who had worked with American forces faced a future in a unified Vietnam, controlled by a government that had no reason to treat them generously and compelling reasons rooted in wartime conduct to treat them harshly. The United States extracted a small number of Montagnard individuals. The communities they had come from, the ones that had borne the cost of alliance with the Americans, were left in place. The prisoner of war camps operated by North Vietnam against American captives and the treatment of South Vietnamese prisoners of war by South Vietnamese and American forces operated simultaneously but asymmetrically in American consciousness during and after the war. The suffering of American prisoners in North Vietnam, which was real and severe, received sustained public attention, congressional advocacy, government negotiation, and ultimately shaped the terms of the Paris Peace Accords. The suffering of South Vietnamese and Viet Cong prisoners in the South Vietnamese prison system, which included the tiger cage cells on Con Son Island that became briefly visible to the American public after congressional investigators documented their existence in 1970, received far less sustained attention and generated far less institutional response. The tiger cages were concrete cells in which prisoners were kept in conditions that constituted torture by any reasonable definition. They had been operating for years before the congressional visit brought them momentarily into public view. The South Vietnamese government built them with American assistance and maintained them with American knowledge. The conditions inside them were documented in American government files. American officials occasionally raised concerns about South Vietnamese prison conditions in internal communications. The conditions continued. The role of the draft in creating the social dynamics of the Vietnam War cannot be separated from the class structure of American society in the 1960s. The draft, in theory, applied to all young American men. In practice, the mechanisms for deferment were most accessible to those with resources to navigate them. College students received automatic deferments. Men with the money to obtain favorable medical evaluations or to hire lawyers to challenge their induction could often avoid service. The burden of service fell disproportionately on men who lacked these resources, men without college options, men from working class and rural backgrounds, men from Black and Latino communities who found that the deferment system was less responsive to their situations than it was to those of white men with more economic and educational capital. The casualty rates among Black American soldiers in the early years of the war were disproportionate relative to their numbers in the general population, a pattern that generated controversy and that the military addressed with some policy changes in assignment practices without eliminating the underlying inequity. The men who actually served in Vietnam and who bore the casualties were not a cross-section of American society. They were the part of American society that the deferment system did not protect. The collapse of South Vietnam in April of 1975 happened with a speed that the official American assessments of South Vietnamese capabilities had not predicted, or had predicted privately while publicly maintaining a different assessment. The North Vietnamese Easter Offensive of 1972 had demonstrated that South Vietnamese forces could not hold ground against conventional North Vietnamese military operations without American air support, and the Paris Peace Accords of 1973 removed that air support as a sustainable option. American officials who monitored the situation after the Accords and before the final collapse filed assessments of South Vietnamese military readiness and political cohesion that were substantially less optimistic than the public statements emanating from the administration. When the North Vietnamese began their final offensive in early 1975, and South Vietnamese units began to collapse and withdraw in ways that turned withdrawal into rout, the American intelligence and diplomatic communities had very little time to act on a developing situation that their own internal assessments should have suggested was more fragile than the official position acknowledged. The evacuation of Saigon on April 29 and 30 of 1975, the images of helicopters lifting people from rooftops and crowds pressing at embassy gates, was not a surprise in the sense of being outside the range of predicted outcomes. It was a surprise only in the sense that it required acting on assessments that had been filed and classified and not acted upon. The Vietnamese who had worked most closely with the Americans, who had worked for the embassy, or for USAID, or for American military units, or for the Phoenix program, who had served as interpreters and drivers and liaison officers and intelligence sources, were among the most vulnerable in the final days before the collapse. Some were evacuated. Many were not. The prioritization of evacuation resources was a decisions process that took place under extraordinary pressure in hours and days, when the situation was deteriorating faster than the available capacity to respond. Some American officials made extraordinary efforts to get their Vietnamese colleagues and employees out. Other officials departed on schedule or earlier, leaving Vietnamese who had been promised assistance to whatever fate the change of government would bring. The re-education camps that the victorious communist government established for former South Vietnamese military officers, government employees, and people associated with the American effort held hundreds of thousands of people for periods ranging from months to years to more than a decade. The conditions in those camps included forced labor, inadequate food, political indoctrination, and in a significant number of cases, death from disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment. This outcome was not unforeseeable. It was one of the outcomes that made the withdrawal from Vietnam, for many who had been involved, a deeply uncomfortable moral accounting. The war in Vietnam killed approximately 58,000 American service members. It wounded several 100,000 more. It left unknown numbers with psychological injuries that did not appear in the official casualty counts. The Vietnamese casualties, which the American accounting of the war tends to treat as a secondary consideration, were of a different order of magnitude entirely. Estimates of Vietnamese war dead, combatant and civilian, North and South, range from 1 million to 3 million or more, with the uncertainty in those estimates itself reflecting the limited priority that was given to documenting them. The physical destruction of the Vietnamese landscape through bombing, defoliation, and the construction of bases and roads and facilities that altered the terrain permanently created environmental damage that continues to affect Vietnamese communities in the regions most intensively affected. Unexploded ordnance left in the soil of Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia continues to kill and maim people who encounter it in the course of agriculture and construction, at a rate that remains significant enough to be tracked by international clearance programs. The war ended in 1975 in the formal sense, but its material effects did not end and in some dimensions have not ended yet. The MIA accounting mission, which continues to operate and which regularly makes news when remains are identified and returned to American families, represents one of the more durable institutional consequences of the war. The question of whether American personnel remained alive and held as prisoners in Southeast Asia after the official end of the war became a significant political issue in the late 1970s and 1980s and generated advocacy organizations, congressional investigations, and policy commitments to the fullest possible accounting. The evidence that any American prisoners remained alive in captivity after the war ended is limited and disputed among specialists in the field. The evidence that some American remains were unrecovered and that the Vietnamese government held information that could assist in their identification was more substantial. And the accounting mission has produced real identifications over the years since normalization of relations made cooperation more feasible. The political energy around the MIA issue was real and in some ways served to maintain a particular emotional register in American thinking about the war, one in which American suffering remained the primary lens through which the war's aftermath was examined, and Vietnamese responsibility for ongoing American grief was a usable political framing. The normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam, which occurred in 1995, happened against a background of ongoing controversy about the MIA accounting and about the trade and strategic interests that both governments recognized as reasons for normalized relations. The decision to normalize was opposed by some veterans organizations and some family members of missing personnel who believed that the Vietnamese government had not provided full cooperation with the accounting mission. It was supported by others, including some veterans, who argued that normalization was the most effective path to greater Vietnamese cooperation and that the ongoing separation served no one's interests. The normalization happened. Trade and diplomatic relations were established. American investment in Vietnam grew. The country that the United States had spent more than a decade trying to prevent from becoming a unified communist state became a significant trading partner of the United States within 2 decades of the war's end, developing an economy that looked substantially like the export-oriented capitalism that the Cold War framing had positioned as the only alternative to communist totalitarianism. The history of the Vietnam War, as it has been taught in American schools and as it has circulated in American popular culture, has emphasized certain elements and suppressed others in ways that are not random and have served particular purposes. The narrative of the noble but misguided soldier, the veteran as victim of political failure rather than participant in moral complexity, has been more culturally available than narratives that require examining what the soldiers actually did in Vietnam and what the institutional structure within which they operated, required, and enabled them to do. The narrative of the suffering veteran has been more culturally available than narratives of Vietnamese suffering. The narrative of American confusion and loss has been more available than narratives of American choice and its consequences. These patterns in the popular historical memory reflect something about what the country needed to be able to believe about itself, and something about which constituencies had the power to shape the available narratives. They are not lies, exactly. The soldiers were in many cases victims of political failure. American confusion was real. The losses were real. But these truths existed alongside other truths that did not make it into the dominant narrative with the same consistency or the same force. The generation of military officers who served in Vietnam as junior and mid-grade officers and who rose to senior positions in the 1980s and 1990s carried with them the institutional lessons of the war, some of them the right lessons and some of them the wrong ones. The Weinberger Doctrine, articulated by Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger in 1984 and elaborated by General Colin Powell in what became the Powell Doctrine, represented one response to the institutional memory of Vietnam. Commit military force only when vital national interests are at stake, only when there is a clear achievable objective, only with sufficient force to achieve that objective quickly, and only with credible public support. These were lessons drawn from a particular reading of why Vietnam failed. a reading that emphasized the constraints placed on military operations by political considerations and the erosion of public support over time. They were lessons that said the problem with Vietnam was that it had been fought wrong, not that it had been fought at all, or that the decision-making processes that led to it had been fundamentally corrupted. The doctrines that emerged from Vietnam's institutional memory contained within them the seeds of later applications of military force that reproduced some of the same patterns even while formally incorporating the lessons of the earlier failure. The men who flew the B-52 missions over Laos and Cambodia, who dropped their loads on coordinates they were given and returned to bases in Thailand and Guam, were not told that their flight records were being falsified. They were given 2 sets of coordinates and they followed procedures. The falsification happened in the paperwork, in the command structure, in the offices where the records were generated and filed. The pilots and crews were instruments of a policy they did not fully know they were instruments of. This is a pattern that appears throughout the war in different forms. Individuals performing their assigned functions within a system whose full dimensions they did not see, carrying out orders that were given to them through legitimate military channels, and participating in outcomes that the official record would later either justify through selective framing or simply not address. The moral complexity of individual participation in institutional wrongdoing is not something that the American accounting of the Vietnam War has resolved, partly because resolving it would require a more thorough examination of the institutional wrongdoing itself than the official record has ever provided. The veteran service organizations that advocated for veterans after the war, and that continue to advocate today, operated within the same gap between official acknowledgement and lived reality that had characterized the war itself. The claims for Agent Orange-related health conditions took decades to achieve official recognition, with the Veterans Administration initially denying or minimizing the connection between herbicide exposure and illness, and the manufacturers of the herbicide using their resources to resist liability. The research that eventually established the connections clearly enough to compel official action was produced against institutional resistance. The veterans who brought those claims and who organized to press them were doing something that the institutional culture of the military and the veterans' bureaucracy did not initially support and in some cases actively discouraged. They were insisting that their experience of the war included dimensions that the official record had not captured, and that the gap between what they had been told and what had happened to them deserved formal recognition. The recognition came, partially unevenly over decades. For many of the veterans most affected, it came too late. The Vietnamese American community that developed in the United States after the fall of Saigon, composed in large part of people who had fled the communist victory and who settled in cities across the country, carried with them memories of the war and of American promises and of American withdrawal that the mainstream American narrative rarely incorporated. The experience of the boat people who fled Vietnam in the years following the war's end in vessels that were often inadequate for the journey and who faced robbery, assault, and death at sea in large numbers was documented but never received the sustained American public attention that might have been expected given the American responsibility for the conditions that produced the flight. The resettlement of Vietnamese refugees in the United States was managed by a bureaucratic and voluntary sector apparatus that was not designed for the scale of the need, and that produced outcomes ranging from successful integration to profound dislocation, depending on where people landed and what resources were available to them. The Vietnamese American community became in time a substantial and, in many respects, successful presence in American society. But the path from the fall of Saigon to that outcome passed through suffering that the official American narrative of the war's end rarely fully acknowledged. The soldiers who participated in the massacre at My Lai and who were not prosecuted, who were protected by officers who suppressed the investigation, who lived their subsequent lives in communities that did not know what they had done, represent a form of unresolved accounting that the American legal and military system chose not to resolve. The decision to prosecute Calley, and not the officers above him who ordered the operation and covered up its results, the decision to give Calley a sentence that he did not fully serve, The decision to accept that the institutional accountability for My Lai would be limited to one man's partial punishment was made by people with authority over those decisions. It was made in a context in which the full documentation of what had happened and who had known what was available within the system. The Peers Commission inquiry documented the command failures and the cover-up with considerable thoroughness. That documentation went into the official record without producing accountability for the officers it named. The gap between what the documentation showed and what the accountability process produced is a gap that the American legal and military system built and chose to maintain. The Laotian Civil War, which ran parallel to the Vietnam War and which the American intervention in Vietnam was in many ways inextricable from, produced a set of outcomes that the American public was largely unable to follow because the American involvement in Laos was officially denied throughout most of the period in which it was occurring. The Plain of Jars, a plateau in central Laos that was the site of some of the most intensive bombing in history, was bombed by American aircraft throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s in a campaign that left the landscape so saturated with unexploded ordnance that agricultural activity in the region is still affected today. The populations that lived on the Plain of Jars were displaced by the bombing, and many who were not displaced were killed. The documentation of the bombing and its effects was classified and remained largely inaccessible to the public for years after the war ended. The country of Laos today remains one of the most heavily bombed countries per capita in history, and the clearance of unexploded ordnance from the Plain of Jars and other heavily affected areas is an ongoing operation that will continue for decades. The relationship between the American prosecution of the Vietnam War and the development of American military doctrine, procurement policy, and strategic culture is a thread that runs from the 1970s through the present without a clear endpoint. The lessons that were drawn from Vietnam, correctly and incorrectly, shaped the choices made in subsequent conflicts from Grenada through the Gulf War, through Iraq and Afghanistan. The emphasis on precision and technology as solutions to the problems of counterinsurgency, the belief that superior firepower can substitute for the political relationships and social conditions that determine whether a population supports or resists a government, the institutional reluctance to acknowledge when a strategy is not working before the costs have become prohibitive. All of these patterns that were visible in Vietnam appeared in subsequent operations with modifications in form but recognizable continuity in substance. The soldiers who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan encountered situations that veterans of Vietnam found familiar in ways that were not coincidental. The institutional response to strategic failure, which is to find tactical innovations that postpone the moment of accounting rather than to question the premises of the strategy, was not a lesson that the American military establishment fully learned from Vietnam, because fully learning it would require a more honest accounting of what went wrong and why than the institutional culture has been able to sustain. The Vietnamese government's own historical accounting of the war, which is the official history of a state that won the conflict and that has its own reasons for presenting the war in particular ways, contains its own distortions. The casualties suffered by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were enormous and were for decades understated in Vietnamese official accounts. The treatment of South Vietnamese civilians and former government officials and military personnel after the communist victory, which included the re-education camp system, and the economic policies that created conditions pushing hundreds of thousands to flee as boat people, has been acknowledged partially and described in minimizing terms in the official Vietnamese historical narrative. The war as it is understood in Vietnam today is not the war as it is understood in the United States, and neither of those understandings corresponds in full to the war as it was lived by the people most directly affected by it. The question of what the war was for, a question that was present from the beginning and that the architects of the war worked steadily to prevent from becoming too visible or too pressing, was never answered during the war in a way that could sustain itself against the evidence of the war's actual conduct and costs. The domino theory, The idea that the fall of South Vietnam to communism would trigger a cascade of communist takeovers across Southeast Asia was the public rationale that held together the American commitment through multiple administrations. The documents in the Pentagon Papers showed that the private assessments of the domino theory's validity were considerably more skeptical than the public invocations of it suggested. The countries that did not fall to communism after the fall of South Vietnam, which is most of them, constitute a kind of negative evidence about the theory's predictive accuracy that the advocates of the war have handled with varying degrees of acknowledgement. The domino theory was not simply wrong as an empirical prediction. It was used instrumentally as a public justification for decisions that were being made on other grounds, and the private doubts about its validity were filed and classified and not allowed to surface in the public debate where they might have altered the political conditions under which the war was being prosecuted. The memorial that was built in Washington in 1982, the black granite wall with its list of names, represented a form of national acknowledgement that was contested from the beginning. The design by Maya Lin was attacked by some veterans and some politicians as insufficiently honorific, as a wound in the earth rather than a monument to heroism. And the statue of 3 soldiers was added later as a compromise to critics who wanted something more conventionally martial. The wall, with its names, does something that the conventional war memorial does not do. It makes the scale of individual loss visible in a way that is impossible to abstract. Each name on the wall is a specific person who died in a specific place at a specific time for reasons that the wall does not explain. The wall does not say whether the death was justified or unjustified. It does not say whether the war was worth what it cost. It records the names of the dead, and it allows the people who touch those names to bring whatever they know or believe about the war to that moment of contact. It is a monument to the cost of the war in American lives. The costs paid by others are elsewhere and less visible. The village of Ben Tre, which was the site of an engagement in February of 1968, during which an American officer said, or was reported to have said, that it became necessary to destroy the town to save it, has become a phrase that circulates in American discourse as a shorthand for the self-defeating logic of the war. The actual statement, which was made to an AP correspondent and which the officer later disputed in its precise wording, captured something that was operationally real, that the American military did systematically destroy Vietnamese communities in the process of claiming to protect them, and that the logic of the war sometimes required accepting the destruction of what was being protected as a cost of the protection. The phrase has been quoted and requoted so many times that it has become somewhat detached from the specific event that produced it and functions more as a general indictment. But the event itself was real, and the logic it expressed was real, and the villages destroyed in that logic numbered in the hundreds. The soldiers who served in Vietnam and who came home to find that the country had moved on, had processed the war in its own way, and arrived at conclusions that did not always leave room for the experiences of the people who had actually been there, developed a community of memory and grievance that has been more visible in some periods of American culture than others. The image of the Vietnam veteran as a damaged and potentially dangerous figure, which circulated through American popular culture in the 1970s, was replaced in subsequent decades by other images: the noble warrior, the victim of political betrayal, the forgotten hero, that served different cultural purposes, but that shared with the earlier image a tendency to use the veteran as a vehicle for national self-examination, while keeping the actual experience of the war at a certain remove. The veterans themselves, who were the people with the most direct knowledge of what the war had been, found that their testimony was received and processed in ways that fit it into pre-existing narratives, rather than allowing it to complicate those narratives. The veterans who spoke most publicly were often the ones whose stories fit most neatly into available frameworks. The ones whose stories were harder to assimilate were quieter, by choice or by lack of audience. By the early 1970s, the American military in Vietnam was in a state of institutional breakdown that the official reporting had not captured and that the command structure was struggling to manage. Units refused orders. Officers were killed by their own men. Drug addiction was widespread. The racial tensions that existed in American society at large were present in the military in concentrated and volatile form, with black soldiers who had served in disproportionate numbers and suffered disproportionate casualties in the earlier years of the war, asserting themselves in ways that the military's racial hierarchy was not designed to accommodate. The institution that had entered Vietnam in the early 1960s as a high-functioning, disciplined force had been transformed by a decade of war into something considerably more troubled, and the transformation was not reversed when the troops came home. The problems that the military had accumulated in Vietnam followed the institution back to the United States and required years of internal reform to address. Reforms that are not typically associated in the popular narrative with the legacy of Vietnam, but that were direct consequences of what the war had done to the force. The United States government spent more than $500 billion in today's equivalent values on the Vietnam War over the course of its involvement. That spending produced no permanent strategic benefit. It did not prevent the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. It did not demonstrate the credibility of American military commitment in ways that altered the strategic calculations of adversaries in other theaters. It did produce a generation of traumatized veterans, a divided society, a set of institutional lessons that were only partially learned and partially applied, and a template for the kind of strategic self-deception that has appeared in subsequent American military involvements in forms recognizable to anyone who had studied Vietnam. The money was spent. The lives were spent. The strategic objectives were not achieved. The accounting of why this happened, which would require examining the decision-making processes and the information environments and the institutional incentives that produced the decisions, has never been completed in a form that the institutions most directly responsible have accepted. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were negotiated over a period of years and signed with public ceremony and private understanding on all sides that they were unlikely to produce a durable peace. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho shared the Nobel Peace Prize for the Accords, an award that Tho declined and that Kissinger accepted to considerable controversy. The Accords allowed the United States to withdraw its forces while maintaining a fiction of South Vietnamese viability that everyone involved knew was contingent on continued American air support and economic assistance that the political conditions in the United States made unsustainable. Kissinger himself said privately what he acknowledged publicly only years later, that he expected South Vietnam to survive no more than a year or two after American withdrawal. The Accords were a mechanism for managing American disengagement, not a peace settlement, and they were understood as such by the people who negotiated them. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded for a document that everyone who signed it knew was not going to produce peace. The bodies of American service members killed in Vietnam were returned to the United States and handled through military mortuary systems in ways that were designed in part to manage the domestic political optics of the war's casualties. The policy of returning remains in individual cases rather than in mass operations, of presenting deaths in manageable numbers rather than in ways that would make the scale of casualties viscerally available to the public, was an operational component of the information management that characterized the entire American conduct of the war. The flag-draped coffins arrived at Dover Air Force Base, and for much of the war, the media was not permitted to photograph them. The restriction on coffin photography was maintained through multiple administrations and was eventually lifted after significant debate in 2009, decades after the war that had given it its origin had ended. The management of the visual record of American casualties was a form of information control that operated in parallel with the statistical manipulation of body counts and the classification of operational details, all of it serving the same ultimate function of maintaining a public information environment that was more favorable to the continuation of the war than the unmanaged reality would have allowed. The war continued in the sense of killing people for more than 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords were signed. It continued in Laos, where fighting between communist forces and CIA-backed groups continued until the Pathet Lao took full control of the country in 1975. It continued in Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge fought the Lon Nol government that had been installed after the American-backed coup against Prince Sihanouk, until the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh in April 1975, 2 weeks before the fall of Saigon. The Khmer Rouge government that then took power over Cambodia proceeded to implement one of the most extreme and lethal social transformations in modern history, evacuating cities, eliminating educated classes, destroying institutions, and killing somewhere between 1 and 2 million of Cambodia's approximately 7 million people in a genocide that lasted until the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1978 ended the Khmer Rouge regime. The American bombing campaign that preceded the Khmer Rouge victory, the American support for forces that sought to prevent that victory, and the conditions the bombing created in rural Cambodia were all woven into the context that produced the genocide. None of this was publicly available information when it was happening. The connections between American policy choices and Cambodian outcomes were debated among scholars and disputed by policymakers, and continue to be. But the bombing happened, the destabilization happened, the genocide happened, and the sequence is not in dispute, even if the causal weight assigned to each element is. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973 under the terms of the Paris Peace Accords. The American advisors and civilian personnel who remained in South Vietnam continued their work in support of a government whose sustainability was decreasing with each passing month. The North Vietnamese violated the accords systematically, as the Americans expected they would, moving troops and equipment into the South in ways that the ceasefire was supposed to prohibit. The South Vietnamese government violated the accords in ways that were less consequential because South Vietnamese military capacity was declining relative to North Vietnamese capacity in ways that the accords had not reversed. The American Congress, responding to the public exhaustion with the war, and to the revelations that had accumulated about the gap between official statements and actual conduct, passed legislation that limited the president's ability to recommit American forces and that restricted American military involvement in Southeast Asia. The Nixon administration, weakened by the Watergate scandal that was unfolding simultaneously, was not in a position to resist those congressional constraints or to make credible commitments to South Vietnamese leaders who needed assurances of American support. The assurances that were given were not backed by the political conditions that would have made them credible. When the North Vietnamese military offensive began in earnest in early 1975, the South Vietnamese military response collapsed faster than the most pessimistic American assessments had projected. Units that had been trained and equipped with American resources and American doctrine dissolved under pressure. Officers abandoned their men. The social compact of the South Vietnamese military, which had never been entirely solid, gave way under the weight of a military situation that had become genuinely hopeless. The civilian population that had been told for years that the government would protect them attempted to flee, creating floods of refugees that clogged the roads and further disrupted any organized military response. The final weeks were a compression of everything the war had been into a brief and terrible conclusion. The gap between what people had been told and what was actually happening, the institutional failure to acknowledge reality until it was too late to act on the acknowledgement. The civilian populations bearing costs that the military and political decisions had imposed on them without their meaningful consent, and the people most closely associated with the losing side finding themselves abandoned by allies whose commitments had always been conditional on political calculations they had no control over. The American embassy in Saigon burned documents in the final hours. The destruction of records was an operational necessity given the circumstances, but it was also a metaphor that the circumstances did not require, and that nevertheless fit precisely. The records that were burned, the files of South Vietnamese employees and intelligence assets, and informants and cooperators, the operational records of programs that had not been publicly acknowledged, the personnel files that documented who had worked with whom and what they had done, went into the fires for practical reasons. They also took with them documentation that would never be fully reconstructed, names and associations and operational histories that existed nowhere else, adding to a body of unrecoverable information that had been accumulating throughout the war as classification and compartmentalization and deliberate destruction had kept the full picture of American operations from being available even within the government that was conducting them. The American military began the long process of institutional reconstruction in the years after Vietnam, a process that is conventionally dated from the establishment of the all-volunteer force in 1973 and the doctrinal and organizational reforms of the 1970s and 1980s. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 reorganized military command structures. The development of air-land battle doctrine created new frameworks for conventional military operations. The rebuilding of military professionalism and institutional cohesion was real, and produced a force that performed very differently in the Gulf War of 1991 than the force that had served in Vietnam had performed in its final years. The reforms were genuine. They did not, however, address the deeper questions about civil-military relations and political decision-making and information management that the Vietnam War had raised. The technical and tactical lessons were absorbed. The strategic and institutional lessons were more selectively processed. Vietnam produced a generation of Americans who had been told things about their country and their government that turned out not to be true, not in the sense of ordinary political hyperbole, but in the deeper sense of systematic institutional deception about matters of life and death. That generation's experience created a political culture in which institutional trust was lower than it had been, in which official statements were received with skepticism, in which the gap between what governments say and what governments do was a more visible feature of political consciousness than it had been before. Some of what came from that shift was useful and necessary and represented a healthier relationship between citizens and institutions than the deference that had preceded it. Some of it was less useful. The erosion of the possibility of shared institutional trust, which the Vietnam War accelerated along with other events of the period, is a condition that did not reverse when the war ended. It became a permanent feature of the political landscape that those who came after inherited without choosing. The war in Vietnam killed between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese people, depending on whose estimates and which categories are included in the count. It killed 58,318 Americans whose names are on the wall in Washington. It killed tens of thousands of South Koreans, Australians, New Zealanders, and other allied nationals. It killed hundreds of thousands of Cambodians and Laotians in the wider regional conflict. The exact numbers are not known and will not be known because the conditions of the war made comprehensive accounting impossible and because the political conditions after the war made comprehensive accounting uncomfortable for all of the governments that might have conducted it. The uncertainty in the numbers is not accidental. It reflects decisions made during and after the war about which deaths were worth counting precisely, which casualties were worth tracking carefully, which victims of the conflict had sufficient standing to be enumerated in the official record with the same care and completeness that was applied to others. The United States dropped more than 7 million tons of bombs on Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, more than 3 times the total tonnage dropped by all sides in the Second World War. The physical record of that bombing is visible in the landscape of Laos today, where the density of bomb craters in some areas is such that the terrain looks from above, like a surface struck by meteor showers. The clearance of unexploded ordnance from that landscape, the bombs and cluster munitions and rockets that failed to detonate on impact and that remain dangerous decades later, is ongoing and will continue for decades more. The people who step on those munitions while farming their fields or building their houses are casualties of a war that ended more than 50 years ago in a country that was not even officially at war with the United States during the period when most of the bombing occurred. They appear in no American casualty count. Their names are not on any wall. The secret air war over Laos, which the American government denied was happening while it was happening and acknowledged partially in the years after it ended, was conducted by Air America, which was a CIA proprietary airline, and by regular military aircraft operating undercover programs that generated falsified documentation. The people who flew those missions were American military personnel and CIA contract employees, who understood that the operations they were conducting were not fully consistent with the public positions the American government was taking about its activities in Laos. They conducted the operations anyway because they were given orders through legitimate channels and because the culture of the institutions they served did not provide effective mechanisms for raising the kinds of concerns that might have given them pause. The operations continued for years. The bombs fell on the Plain of Jars and on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and on Pathet Lao positions, and on villages where the distinction between military targets and civilian habitations was not always clearly maintained. The documentation was classified. The operations were denied. They happened. The soldiers who were ordered into the A Shau Valley in West and South Vietnam, or into the Iron Triangle north of Saigon, or into the street fighting of Hue during the Tet Offensive, or into any of the other locations where the intensity of the fighting was such that death was a likely outcome of the mission, went because they were soldiers and because their orders sent them there. Some of them believed in what they were doing. Some of them had stopped believing long before, but continued because the alternative to following orders was not available to them in any practical sense. Some of them were very young, 18 and 19 years old, and had not had time to form the kind of settled conviction that either belief or disbelief would require. They went into those places and some of them died and some of them killed, and some of them came home and found that the country they had fought for had moved on and was asking them to move on too, and some of them could and some of them could not. And the institution that had sent them there was not designed to tell the difference. The war did not end cleanly. It did not end with lessons learned and accountability established and the truth of what had happened placed on the record in a form that would prevent repetition. It ended with a helicopter lifting off a roof in Saigon, and with fires burning in the embassy courtyard, and with hundreds of thousands of people who had allied themselves with the losing side, trying to find ways out of the country they had lived in all their lives. It ended with veterans coming home to a country that did not know quite what to do with them. It ended with files classified and records burned, and investigations that produced documentation that went into archives. It ended with the communist government that the United States had spent 20 years and 58,000 lives and hundreds of billions of dollars trying to prevent from controlling all of Vietnam. The institutions that had managed the war continued to function. The people who had made the decisions that produced the outcomes continued, most of them, to hold their positions or to retire to comfortable obscurity. The country processed its losses and moved forward. In 1975, the final year of American involvement, the Defense Attaché Office in Saigon continued to file reports through the chain of command. The reports documented the deteriorating military situation with the same format and the same metrics that had been used throughout the war. The situation was assessed. The trends were noted. The implications were discussed. The reports were transmitted to Washington, where they were received and filed. The war continued to be processed through the institutional machinery that had processed it for more than a decade, producing outputs that went into the system, even as the situation on the ground made the entire enterprise increasingly academic. The last report from the Defense Attaché Office was filed on April 29, 1975, the day before Saigon fell. It assessed the military situation in terms of the categories and frameworks that had been applied throughout the war. Outside the building where it was written, the city was collapsing. The report was transmitted. It went somewhere. The city fell.